In this video, you will learn everything necessary to feed, maintain, and use Sourdough Starter to make amazing sourdough bread every time. Hi, I'm Ron, and thanks for clicking on this Sourdough Starter video. To say thank you for doing so, I'm going to mail free of charge to 5 lucky recipients some of my very own sourdough starter that I use daily. To be eligible, all you have to do is these 4 things. Click the subscribe button, the notification bell, the like button, and leave a comment. If you're already a subscriber, simply click the like button and leave a comment. Also, the format of this video is a little different than my other YouTube videos. Today, I'll show a question that I've been asked or I've seen posted, then I'll give my answer. Remember, sourdough bread is very forgiving and there are nearly as many variations as there are bakers. This is just one way, the way I prefer. What are feeding ratios? Feeding ratios refer to the amount of flour and water that is added to the sourdough starter measured by weight. For example, assuming 50 grams of starter, a 1:1:1 ratio would add 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water to 50 grams of starter. A 1:2:2 ratio, which is the most common and the ratio I've used for years, would add 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water to 50 grams of starter. And a 1:5:5 ratio, and assuming we begin with 40 grams of starter, 200 grams of flour and 200 grams of water would be added or fed to the starter. When is my starter ready to make dough? Once it has doubled in volume, you're ready to make dough. The black line on this jar of starter indicates its level immediately after being fed. It has now doubled in volume and is ready to be used. Try to use the starter while it is still rising and has a dome shape on top, and before the sourdough starter begins to fall. What is the float test? After the starter has been fed and doubles in volume, some bakers will drop some of the starter in a container of water to see if it floats. Personally, I don't feel this test is necessary. But if you do it, keep in mind that some of your starter may float and some may not. The starter on the top of the container usually will float because it is full of air. That's why it has risen to the top. The starter on the bottom probably will not float because it has no air, which is why it's on the bottom of the sourdough starter container. The assumption is if the starter floats, it's ready to be used, and if it doesn't, it should not be used. Does it matter what flour I use to feed my sourdough starter? Any flour can be used to feed your sourdough starter. However, many people feel including some rye flour and/or whole wheat flour creates a more vibrant starter. I store my own sourdough starter mixing flour in this number 10 silver can, which consists of 1/3 rye flour, 1/3 whole wheat flour, and 1/3 all-purpose flour. I keep the canister in the fridge. What do I do with my starter if I'm not baking for a few days or even weeks? My starter sits on the kitchen counter at room temperature, and each morning I feed it for the day's sourdough making. But if for whatever reason I'm not going to make sourdough today, I will feed my starter 10 grams of flour and 10 grams of water and leave it on the counter for tomorrow's sourdough making. If I'm not going to be making bread for several days or weeks, I'll put the jar in the fridge. Then the day before I resume making sourdough, I'll take it out of the fridge, feed it 10 grams of flour and 10 grams of water, and leave it on the kitchen counter overnight, ready for the following day's normal feeding and sourdough making. What is the no discard method? A better name for the no discard method might be the one jar method, in that one jar is used to store your starter, feed your starter, and withdraw starter for dough making. Let me illustrate. Okay, try not to laugh at my artistic talent. In this drawing of the no discard method, or one jar method, the black line represents a quart jar. The blue X's represent 50 grams of existing starter. The green is 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water added to the jar, and the red represents the starter doubling in volume over time. So we started with 50 grams of starter, and now we have 250 grams of starter. 200 grams of starter is withdrawn to make today's sourdough, as indicated by the pink vertical box. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that in the 50 grams left behind in the jar is 10 grams of the old starter and 40 grams of the new flour and water added today, which is new food to the old 10 grams of starter. I believe this continual feeding of the starter promotes a strong, vibrant, active sourdough starter that produces amazing sourdough bread. What is hydration and what is the correct amount? In the sourdough starter, I use 100% hydration, meaning equal amount of flour and water by weight. In dough making, many percentages are used, but I think the most common and the only one I use is 70%, meaning whatever amount of flour is in the dough, I will add 70% of that amount by weight in water. Here is the formula I use to make one loaf of sourdough bread. 450 grams of flour, 300 grams of water, 100 grams of sourdough starter, and 10 grams of salt. In my dough, I have 450 grams of bread flour plus 50 grams of flour in the sourdough starter for a total of 500 grams of flour. I include 300 grams of water plus 50 grams of water from the starter for a total of 350 grams of water. 350 is 70% of 500. I always have 20% starter, and 100 is 20% of 500. I always have 2% salt, and 2% of 500 is 10. Thanks again for watching this video. Remember my invitation at the beginning to give away some of my sourdough starter, and please check out some of my other YouTube videos.